The candle had burned down to a stub by the time Nora descended the cellar stairs. She had been sent for preserves, no more than that, a half-dozen jars of last autumn's quince for the housekeeper's shelf, and she had carried her tallow light carefully down the narrow stone steps, careful not to let the flame gutter in the cold draught that came up from below. Kelhurst Park had 37 rooms above ground, and she had learned in her 6 months of service one long vault beneath the east wing that smelled of turned earth and old iron. She had never been sent down before. She would not have chosen to go now, had the choice been hers. Choices, as she had come to understand since her father's death, and the dissolution of everything he had left her, were not the currency of housemaids. The jars were on the far wall, behind a rack of bottled claret that had been waiting there since someone who was not the current Earl had thought to lay them down. She took the first of the quince jars, and then the second, and tucked them beneath her arm, and turned back toward the stairs. And then the candle tilted in her hand, and the light fell, in that particular angle, along the base of the far stone pillar. There were words carved there, deep and deliberate, the letters cut not in a child's idle scratching, but with the patience of someone who had meant them to last. Henry Wentworth Caldecott, rightful Earl of Ashmore, son of Thomas. Nora stood very still. She had heard enough in the servants' hall to understand the shape of what she was looking at. She had heard Mrs. Platt, the housekeeper, lower her voice when the solicitor called. She had heard the footman, Barrow, say that the young lord's temper came from guilt, not grief. She had heard the Countess Dowager tell her daughter-in-law, Lady Forsyth, in the blue drawing-room, that certain things were best left where they had been buried. She had not known, until this moment, that they had been buried quite so literally. The mortar around the carving was old. Whoever had put the name there had done so long before Nora Ashby had ever come to Kelhurst, long before she had sewn her initials into the collar of her spare apron and learned which step on the back staircase creaked and which could be trusted. Long before she had understood that the present Earl of Ashmore, Robert Caldecott, was a man who crossed a room in 4 strides and spoke in sentences so clipped they seemed to cost him something, and that this manner had, in the beginning, seemed to her like arrogance, and had seemed to her later like grief, and had seemed to her later still like something she did not have a word for. She pressed her free hand flat against the cold stone beside the carving. Then she took her candle and her jars of quince and went back upstairs without a sound. If you have ever stood at the edge of something enormous and understood that stepping forward would change every arrangement around you, then you understand what the servants' hall felt like to Nora Ashby that November morning, when she set the quince jars on Mrs. Platt's shelf and said nothing. She had arrived at Kelhurst in April, following the sale of her father's estate in Wiltshire. Her father, Mr. Arthur Ashby of Combe Ashby, had been a gentleman of modest property and spectacular carelessness, with bills of exchange. He had died in March, owing more than Nora had known existed, and the entail had passed to a male cousin she had never met, and the house had gone to the creditors, and Nora had sat in the emptied morning room and understood that the life she had been raised to expect was over. She was 22 years old, educated above her new station, and she had her father's brown eyes and her mother's sense of discipline and nothing else of practical use to anyone. She had answered the advertisement because it was the only one that had not asked for prior experience in service. Mrs. Platt had interviewed her with the wary thoroughness of a woman accustomed to young women who thought service would be temporary, and had offered her the position without warmth, and Nora had accepted it without self-pity. She had come to Kelhurst with 2 trunks and the habit of reading and the ability to be invisible, which was, she had discovered, the quality that servants were paid to have and to maintain. The Countess Dowager had placed the label on her almost immediately. Lady Aldwine had a gift for taxonomy. She had spent 40 years arranging the social world into correct columns, and she experienced anything that resisted arrangement as a personal affront. On the first occasion she had encountered Nora in the gallery, she had looked her over with the specific attention of someone locating an object in the wrong room, and had said to her daughter-in-law, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that the new girl had the unfortunate manner of someone who did not yet understand what she was. That phrase had followed Nora through the house. The upper housemaid repeated it with the faint satisfaction of someone for whom hierarchy was the only warmth available. Even Barrow the footman had offered it once, not unkindly, as a warning. The Countess Dowager had taken a view, he said, and the Countess Dowager's views tended to settle. Nora did not argue with it. She had learned, in the month since her father's death, that arguing with the machinery of social judgment was like arguing with weather. You could observe it, and you could shelter, and you could wait. She waited now, in the first week of November, with the knowledge of what was carved in the cellar sitting in her chest like a stone. The Earl of Ashmore had been at Kelhurst for 10 days, which was 3 days longer than the servants' hall had anticipated. He came in the autumn for the shooting, usually, and departed before the weather turned, and he spent the intervening months in London doing whatever it was that earls did in London that required them to look so consistently as though they had been asked a question no one should be required to answer. He was 34 years old. He had been married, and his wife had died in childbirth, and the child had died with her. And this was known in the household the way foundational things were known, without being spoken. He had noticed Nora on her second week at Kelhurst. She had not understood it as noticing, at first. He had come into the library while she was dusting the upper shelves, and he had stopped in the doorway, and she had turned with her cloth in her hand, and said, "Good morning, my lord." And he had said nothing, and gone away. She had assumed she had been in his way. She had been careful, after that, to be out of his rooms before he had cause to enter them. But he had a habit of appearing in places where she happened to be working, and his appearances did not have the quality of coincidence. He had asked her once, in October, what she was reading in the evenings, and she had told him, and he had looked at her with an expression that she could not parse, and had gone away without comment. He had told her, once, to come in from the kitchen garden when the wind changed, in a voice so flat that she had at first understood it as a reprimand, and had obeyed it, and had stood inside the scullery door bewildered by the warmth that moved through her when the wind did indeed begin to carry rain. He did not speak to her as a lord speaks to a servant. He did not speak to her as anyone had ever spoken to her. He issued instructions the way a man issues instructions when he is afraid to say what he actually means. And Nora had learned, slowly and against her better judgment, to hear the care inside them. She had not told herself it was care. She was not a fool, but she had heard it. The second time the Countess Dowager's phrase was applied to her directly was at the dinner for Lady Forsyth's birthday at the end of October. Nora had been directed to stand in attendance, and she had stood, and she had been nearly invisible, as she had learned to be. And then one of the London guests, a Miss Vane, who had the polished quality of a woman who expected things to be arranged for her benefit, had required something from the sideboard that Nora had not moved quickly enough to provide. And Lady Aldwine had said, into the very slight pause that followed, that the girl simply did not yet know what she was, and that it was the particular problem with women of fallen family who carried their education like a piece of furniture too large for their new rooms. There had been a silence at the table. The Earl of Ashmore had looked up from his glass. He had looked at his mother and at Miss Vane. And then, for a moment that Nora had been certain she had imagined, at Nora. His expression had not changed. He had returned his gaze to the table and said nothing. His hand, on the stem of his glass, had been still in a way that was not the stillness of indifference. Nora had carried the serving dish to Miss Vane and had felt nothing, which was a thing she had gotten very good at. She had thought about the carving in the cellar for 3 days before she did anything. She told herself, in those 3 days, that it was not her affair. She told herself that she could not possibly know what it meant, that there might be 100 explanations for a name cut into a stone pillar 20 feet below a house she had lived in for 6 months, that she was a housemaid and not a solicitor, and not a member of this family in any capacity that gave her right to their inheritance disputes, if that was what it was. She told herself that whatever was buried at Kelhurst had been buried before she arrived and would remain buried when she left, and that intervening in it would not make her less invisible. It would make her considerably more visible in all the ways that would cost her most. She told herself these things, and she believed most of them. But she had seen the Earl of Ashmore's hand on that glass, and she had been before her father died, and her life rearranged itself into a series of other people's rooms. The daughter of a man who believed that the truth was a thing you owed to the world, whether or not it was comfortable. It had not made him solvent. It had not saved his estate or his debts or his daughter's future. She had inherited it from him the way she had inherited his eyes, and she had not yet found a way to set it down. On the 4th morning, she went to the study. She did not have permission to go to the study. The study was for the Earl's morning use, and she was a housemaid, and the appropriate channel for anything a housemaid wished to communicate to an earl was the housekeeper, who would communicate it to the steward, who would communicate it to the first footman, who would in theory communicate it upward, except that Nora understood clearly that a message passing through that chain would arrive at the top, if at all, shorn of everything that mattered about it. She knocked. She heard him say, "Come," and she went in. He was at the desk. He was in his shirt sleeves, which she had not expected, and he was reading a letter. And he looked up at her with an expression that was, for a brief moment, before his composure settled back over it, almost startled. He said, "Miss Ashby." And his voice had the flatness that she had learned to interpret. She said, "I found something in the cellar, my lord, and I believe you should know of it. And I believe you should hear it from me directly rather than through another channel, because I am not confident the other channels would carry it to you in a form you would recognize." There was a silence. He said, "Close the door." She closed it. She told him what she had found, and where she had found it, and how the letters had looked in the candlelight, carved deep and patient, the name and the lineage, and the word, rightful. She told him the mortar around the letters was old. She told him she had touched nothing. She watched his face while she spoke, and his face was still as water under ice, and she thought, not for the first time, that this was a man who had learned very early to let nothing move through to the surface. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How long have you known?" 4 days, she said. 4 days, he repeated. "I was deciding," she said, "whether it was my concern." His eyes moved to her face. He said, "What decided you?" She thought about her father in the emptied morning room. She said, "I was raised to believe that the truth is a debt you cannot default on." "My lord." Something shifted in his expression. It was small, and it was gone almost immediately, but she had been watching carefully, and she saw it. He said, "You will not speak of this to anyone." And she said, "No, my lord." And he said, "I will look at it tonight." And she said, "I can show you where it is." And he said, "I know where the cellar is, Miss Ashby." And his voice carried something underneath the clipped syllables that she thought, standing in his study in the pale November light, might be the closest thing to gratitude she was going to be offered. She went back to her work. That was the word people used for what Nora Ashby was not: work. That was what the Countess Dowager meant when she said the girl did not yet know what she was. She meant that Nora moved through Kelhurst with the carriage and the vocabulary of someone who had been educated for a different life, and that this residue of prior self was a small but persistent affront to the correct arrangement of things. Lady Aldwine spoke the phrase a third time in early November to a caller Nora did not know, a woman from the neighboring estate who had come for the afternoon and whom Lady Aldwine was informing, in the sitting room with the door slightly ajar, of the various arrangements pertaining to Kelhurst's household staff and their particular limitations. The girl from Wiltshire, Lady Aldwine said, with the thoughtful air of someone completing an inventory, still does not know what she is. Some of them never quite learn. Nora, passing the door with a coal scuttle, heard every word. She did not stop. She carried the coal to the morning room and set it by the grate, and she went back along the corridor, and she did not look at the sitting room door. She was good at this. She had become very good at carrying things that were too heavy without letting her face show the weight. What she did not know was that the Earl of Ashmore had come down from the study 10 minutes earlier and had paused at the head of the corridor and had heard his mother's voice through the sitting room door, and had stood there with his hand on the doorframe for a full 2 seconds before Nora appeared at the far end of the corridor with the coal scuttle. And he had watched her pass the sitting room door without flinching, and he had watched her go around the corner, and something in his face, in that empty corridor, had done a thing he had not permitted it to do in a long time. He did not follow her. He went back to his study and sat at the desk and looked at the letter he had not finished reading, and he did not read it. He had gone down to the cellar alone, the evening she had told him, with a lantern and a cold resolve. He had found the carving. He had stood before it for a long time. He had traced the letters with one finger, in the dark. And he had understood several things at once. His father had known. His solicitor, Pemberton, had known that the knowledge had been put underground as deliberately as the letters had been put into the stone, and that he was going to have to do something with it that his mother was not going to be able to accommodate. He had also understood, standing in the cold of that cellar, that the woman who had brought this to him had done it, not because it was required of her, and not because she expected a reward, and not because she had any practical stake in what it meant. She had done it because she believed that the truth was a debt. He thought about that. In the days that followed, more than he thought about the carving, the solicitor Pemberton arrived on the 12th of November. He had been summoned from London without being told why, and he arrived with the slightly cautious bearing of a man who has been keeping a secret for a long time and has grown tired of the weight of it. The Earl received him in the study for 2 hours. No one in the servants' hall knew what was said. Nora cleaned the upper gallery and waited for the shape of things to settle. The Countess Dowager called on her son that afternoon. She went into the study at 4 o'clock and came out again at 20 minutes past and went directly to the sitting room and did not come out for dinner. Mrs. Platt said nothing. Barrow said something under his breath that Nora did not quite catch. The next morning, the Earl sent word that he wished to see Miss Ashby in the study. She went. She closed the door behind her. He was standing at the window this time rather than seated, and the light was thin and gray, and fell on the side of his face and made him look, she thought, like a man who had not slept much, but had made a decision he intended to keep. He said, "I have instructed Pemberton to begin the inquiry. There is a Henry Wentworth Caldecott. He is 26 years old. He has been living in Bath, employed as a drawing master under the name Wentworth." She said, "And you believe the carving is legitimate?" He said, "I believe my father put it there." "Yes," she said. Are you not angry? He looked at her. He said, I was. Then he said, Are you at all curious why I am telling you this? She said, Yes, my lord, quite honestly. He said, Because you are the only person in this house who brought me information she had no obligation to bring me, and you did it because you believed it was owed. I thought you were entitled to know the consequence. She stood with her hands quiet at her sides, and felt the truth of this land in her chest, and felt something else underneath it, something she was not prepared to name. And she said, Thank you, my lord. And his eyes did not move from her face. He said, You understand that this will change your situation here, if you wish it. She said, I do not understand what you mean. He said, It means that when the inquiry resolves, I will ask you a question in the appropriate manner, through the appropriate channel, and I would like to know whether you would be willing to hear it. She stood very still. She thought of her father and his debts, and the emptied morning room, and the 2 trunks she had carried to Kelhurst, and the coal scuttle and the gallery, and the Countess Dowager's voice through the sitting-room door. And she thought of this man standing in a cold cellar with a lantern, tracing a name in the stone. She said, I believe I would be willing to hear it, my lord. He said, Good. And he looked at the window. And he did not look back at her. But the set of his shoulders had changed in a way she had learned to read. She went back to the gallery and stood at the window, and let herself feel for a moment the full weight of what had just happened, and then she went back to work. The inquiry took 6 weeks. Pemberton traveled to Bath. He interviewed a drawing master named Wentworth, who had been told by his mother, shortly before her death, that his father's name was in a house called Kelhurst. He had been told this and had not known what to do with it, and had carried it for 3 years in the way that people carry things they have no framework for. He came to Kelhurst in January, at the invitation of the solicitor, in the company of his employer, and he sat in the study, and he was 26 years old and had his grandfather's eyes, which the housekeeper later told Mrs. Platt she had recognized immediately. The Countess Dowager remained at Kelhurst throughout. She was not asked to leave, and she did not offer to. She sat in the sitting-room with her daughter-in-law and her fan and said very little. She had lost the look of confident authority she had carried through 40 years of the social world, and in its place was something more complicated. Not humility precisely, but the acknowledgement of a woman who has discovered that the order she arranged so carefully had a door in it she had not been told about. On the morning of the 17th of January, after a dinner at which Henry Wentworth Caldecott had sat at the table for the first time and spoken of his life in Bath, with the quiet bewilderment of a man who has been handed back a name he thought belonged to someone else. The Countess Dowager encountered Nora in the corridor outside the dining room. She looked at Nora for a long moment. She said, "You are the one who found it." Nora said, "Yes, my lady." The Countess Dowager looked at her with the expression of a woman revising an inventory and finding she has listed something in the wrong column. She said, I said, more than once, that you did not know what you were. I believe I was mistaken. She went past, down the corridor, without waiting for an answer. Nora stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she went on. The question was asked on a Tuesday, through the appropriate channel, which in this case meant that the Earl spoke to Pemberton, who spoke to the estate steward, who told Mrs. Platt, who came to find Nora in the upper gallery, with an expression that could not quite manage its own composure. The form of the question, as conveyed, was as follows. The Earl of Ashmore wished to know whether Miss Ashby would consent to receive him in the drawing-room that afternoon for a conversation of a personal nature, and whether she would permit him to speak to his cousin Henry, who was taking up his own counsel in these matters. on her behalf. Nora said yes. She said it in the upper gallery with her dustcloth in her hand and a specific shaft of January light on the floor at her feet. And she felt the word move through her the way things move through you when you have been waiting for them long enough that you have stopped expecting them. She went downstairs and changed her dress, which was a gray wool and the second best she owned, and she went to the drawing room. He was already there. He was standing at the hearth, because that was where he stood when he was uncertain, she had noticed, close to the source of warmth, as though heat were a thing he had to remember to seek. He turned when she came in. He looked at her, and she looked at him. And neither of them spoke for a moment. That was not uncomfortable. But was, she thought? The kind of silence that only forms between people who have been listening to each other across a long distance, and have only just arrived at the same room. He said, Nora. Her given name, placed carefully. The syllables quiet and deliberate, and not at all like he had said Miss Ashby in the months before. She said, yes. He said, I want to be clear that I am not asking you because of what you found in the cellar, though I know that is what a skeptical person might conclude. I am asking you because I have been watching you move through this house since April, and you are the only person I have encountered in a considerable number of years who does not carry a mask. And I find that I am tired of being the only person in a room who is wearing one. She said, that is not entirely accurate. I carry a mask. I simply wear it differently than you do. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something happened to his face. The mask he had mentioned. It shifted. And underneath it she saw the man who had stood in the cellar with a lantern tracing his father's hand, and the man who had noticed the wind changing in the kitchen garden. And she felt her own composure move slightly, a controlled and quiet movement, like water finding its own level. He said, will you allow me to ask Henry to speak to you formally? She said, I will. He said, good, and crossed the room, and stood close enough that she could feel the warmth that came off him. And he took her hand in both of his, carefully, as though she were something he had been waiting to hold with the care it deserved. He did not kiss her. He held her hand and looked at her face. And she stood inside the warmth of it, and understood that this was what it felt like when someone saw you clearly and chose you anyway. The season did not hear of it immediately. These things travel at the pace that people decide they should travel. And for 2 weeks the knowledge sat inside Kelhurst, held in the careful stillness of a household that understood that something had shifted and was waiting to see how it settled. Henry Wentworth Caldecott, who had been a drawing master in Bath 3 months earlier, had his conversation with Nora in the library on a Thursday morning. He was a quiet young man with his grandfather's eyes and a way of speaking that suggested he had spent a good deal of his life observing things carefully and waiting to understand them. He told her that his half-brother had spoken to him of her, and that he understood from that conversation something he had not expected to understand. The Earl, whom he was still learning how to think of as his brother, was not a man who spoke easily of things that mattered to him, and that he had spoken of her with an ease that had surprised them both. She said, he has been kind. Henry said, I do not think kindness is what it is. She said, no. I do not think so either. The formal announcement was made in February. At the first dinner at which Henry sat openly at the table in his proper place, the legal resolution having been reached in a form that had satisfied Pemberton and the senior peers who had been asked to witness it, and which had not destroyed the present Earl's position, but had given Henry the name and the portion that were his by right, and which had produced in the Countess Dowager a second and more thorough revision of the inventory of things she had previously been certain of. At that dinner, Lady Aldwine sat at the Earl's left hand and said nothing offensive. This was, in itself, a kind of recognition. Miss Vane, who had been invited as a consideration for Henry, found him more interesting than she had expected a drawing master to be, now that he was not precisely a drawing master, and said so to Lady Forsyth with the candid assessment of someone rearranging their columns. The Earl at the head of his table, with Nora seated where a woman who was not yet his wife, but would be by Michaelmas, sat, with the right and the understanding of the household settled around her, looked down the length of the table, and found her looking back at him, and she saw, in his face, without the mask, something quiet and certain and entirely, irreversibly his own. He did not smile often. He smiled then. She held it, like she had held the candle in the cellar in November, carefully, both hands, aware that what she was carrying was the kind of thing that could illuminate a great deal if you did not let it gutter. By Michaelmas, she had a new name. It was his name, and it was her own, and she had not traded herself for it. She had brought him something he had not known was missing, and he had seen her clearly in the light of what she brought, and he had chosen her from that seeing. The cellar at Kelhurst was not opened again for some time. When it was Henry who went down with a lantern, with Nora beside him, and he stood before the pillar and read his father's hand for the first time. And she held the light while he read it, and neither of them spoke. There was a candle left on the kitchen table that evening, one of the good tallow ones from the housekeeper's supply, and a jar of quince preserve beside it, which was where the housekeeper had set them, and which no one had moved. It was the small kind of thing that does not announce itself. It sat in the warmth of the kitchen at Kelhurst, and the fire was banked, and the house was quiet, and it was enough. If her father had lived to hear how things had settled, he would have said, without satisfaction, only with the mild approval of a man whose principles had been demonstrated useful. The truth is a debt. You cannot default on it. He would not have been wrong. She had not expected the announcement to reach London as quickly as it did. By the 3rd week of February, Pemberton had received 2 letters from men whose names the Earl had mentioned once, in passing, as people who arranged themselves on whatever side of a matter appeared most advantageous. Pemberton shared their existence with the Earl in a voice dry as parchment, and the Earl had set the letters on his desk without opening them, and told Pemberton that the matter was resolved. And Pemberton had said, "Yes, my lord," with the particular satisfaction of a solicitor who has watched an unjust arrangement finally correct itself. There was also a letter from Miss Vane's mother. Nora did not see the letter, but she heard from Mrs. Platt, with the circumspect pleasure of a woman who had been watching events accumulate toward this outcome for some weeks, that it had been brief, and that the Earl had replied to it with 2 sentences. She did not ask what the 2 sentences said. She did not need to. Henry, now established in the East Wing guest rooms and in the complicated position of a young man who had gone to sleep a drawing master and woken to find himself inside a family he had not known he had, came to find Nora in the gallery one morning with a book under his arm and the tentative manner of someone who had decided to be brave about something. He said he had been thinking about the cellar, about what it had cost her father to carve the name there, about the logic of a man who could not speak the truth aloud, but could not bear to let it be entirely lost, and whether she had thought about that. She said she had thought about it a great deal. He said, "My mother told me, near the end, that the name was in a house, but she did not tell me which house or where, only that it was there. I thought it was a story, something she told herself. She said, 'She told you more than she knew.'" He turned the book over in his hands. He said, "I have been thinking that the right thing to do with the drawing instruction is to keep doing it. Not from necessity now, simply because I was good at it." She said, "That seems entirely correct." He looked at her with his grandfather's eyes and said, "You are not what I expected when Robert told me," she said. "What did you expect?" He said, "Someone more dramatic. Someone who had decided to be significant." And she almost laughed, which was something she did rarely, and which, when it happened, she thought her father would have recognized as his. She had been at Kelhurst for 10 months by the time the bans were read. She had arrived with 2 trunks and left the gallery window for last when she cleaned it, because the light at that hour was worth standing in, and she had learned which step creaked and which could be trusted, and she had carried things that were too heavy without letting her face show the weight, and she had gone down to a cold cellar for a jar of quince, and found a name in the stone, and she had stood in a study with her hands quiet at her sides, and told the truth. None of it had looked like courage while she was doing it. It had looked like ordinary days. In March, the Countess Dowager held a small gathering for a half-dozen of the county's most formidable women. Nora was not present at the gathering, but she passed through the corridor twice on household business, and on the second pass she heard the Countess Dowager say, in the carrying voice she used when she intended to be heard, that Ashmore had chosen well, that the girl was steady, that there were women who collapsed under pressure, and women who became more themselves under it, and that she had found, rather late, that she had misjudged which category applied. Nora heard this at the far end of the corridor and walked on. She did not permit herself any expression until she reached the linen cupboard where Mrs. Platt was counting sheets, and Mrs. Platt looked at her face and said, "Well?" And Nora said, "Well." And they did not say anything else. And it was enough. The Earl found her that evening in the library, where she had gone to return a volume she had borrowed with his permission, and which she had found, in the way that books sometimes find you, more necessary than she had anticipated. He was already there, standing at the shelves with his back to the door. And he turned when she came in, and she held up the book. And he said, "Did it answer?" She said, "It answered several things I had not known I was asking." He took the book from her and looked at its spine and set it back on the shelf. And then he stood very close to her and said nothing for a moment. And she was aware of exactly where he was in the room without looking, which was the thing she had become accustomed to and which she had stopped trying to explain to herself in practical terms. He said, "My mother spoke of you this afternoon, and she said she had heard something to that effect." And he said, "She was not wrong." And Nora said no. And he looked at her with the face she had been learning since April, the one underneath the composure, and he said her name again. Nora, quiet and deliberate, the way he had been saying it since January. She said, "Yes." He said it meant what it had meant the first time he said it, that he had found her and intended to keep finding her, that he was a man who did not speak easily of things that mattered to him except when he did, and that she was one of the things that mattered. She had come to understand his vocabulary. She had come to understand that the care in his commands, and the care in his silences, and the care in the way he had looked at the back of her hands in the garden one morning were all the same care, expressed through the only instruments he had reliably available. She put her hand in his, which was where she had learned it belonged, and the fire was warm behind them. And outside the window, the February dark had settled over Kelhurst in the way that winter dark settles over old houses, completely and with a certain authority, but not without the understanding that it would eventually lift. He said, "You should know that I went back down to the cellar last week." She said, "I did not know." He said, "I stood there for a while." And then he said, "My father was not a brave man in the usual sense. He could not let the name be lost." He put it where he thought it would not be disturbed, and it might not have been, except that someone was sent for quince in November, and took a candle instead of a lamp. She said, "Mrs. Platt always keeps the lamps at the top of the stairs." He said, "Yes," and his voice had the thing in it that, she had decided some weeks earlier, was the closest thing he had to the quality other men called warmth, and which in him was warmer for being so rarely on the surface. He said, "It is a considerable debt, what you brought me. I have been trying to think what form the payment should take." She said, "You know that is not why I told you." He said, "I know." He said, "It is why I intend to spend a good deal of time paying it anyway." She stood in the library at Kelhurst on a February evening with the warmth of his hand around hers and the firelight behind them, and the thought of her father, who had believed the truth was a debt you could not default on. And she understood that what she had was not the life she had been raised to expect, but the life that had been waiting in the particular shape that her particular choices had cleared a path toward. She had not been rescued. She had carried a candle down a dark staircase and told the truth about what she found there. And the world had arranged itself around that act in ways she had not anticipated and had not asked for. And here she was. The candle in the cellar had burned down to a stub by the time she went back upstairs in November. She had not thought of it since. She thought of it now, standing in the library in the February evening with the fire and the warmth, and the man who had learned to say her name like it was the thing he had been meaning to say. And she thought of how much can be illuminated by a very small light, if you hold it steady and go where you need to go.